All right. Good morning, good day. Welcome, everyone, to this meeting of the Aspiring Scientists Coalition, also known as ASK. My name is Ben Ryan. I'm a neuroscientist researcher at Stanford University, and I'm the founder of ASK. We got started in 2020, I believe, through social media. And, the goal is just to provide meetings like this you can access from anywhere in the world. I see hi from Bangladesh. Hi, good morning. Actually, if you're here and you please let me know in the chat where you're from. We have members from more than 75 countries, so we're truly nearly global, which is awesome. But I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker, Uma Chatterjee, who's joining us from the University of Texas at Dallas. Uma is a board-certified mental health peer specialist and a graduate student in neuroscience studying psychedelics, OCD, and other conditions like PTSD and chronic pain. Uma also leads many outreach and advocacy activities, including her podcast, which recently launched, called A Chat with Uma, which you should definitely check out. And Uma is not only a researcher and a science advocate, but also an inspiration, which is why we've inspired her to speak with you all today. Because the purpose of ASK is really to connect students who are still figuring things out with those who are more advanced in their career and have figured it out, to provide opportunities for you student members to learn from the experiences that they've had. So today, Uma is going to be talking about her experience with a non-traditional path to neuroscience, advocacy, and psychedelic research. And this presentation and really the entire organization is meant to offer learning opportunities for our members. So if you have a question for Uma, please do not hesitate to ask. If you'd rather not put on your camera or microphone and you just want to put it in the chat, feel free to do that. Or if you want to do it anonymously or nearly anonymously, you can private message it to me. I will read it out loud, and I will never tell a soul that you asked it. So I see in the chat we have members tuning in from Vancouver, Bangladesh, Tahoe, Massachusetts, Texas, India, Costa Rica, Hong Kong, which is really awesome. So I couldn't be more excited. Uma, without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you so much. Your introduction was so kind. And let me just share my screen. Awesome. Can everybody see my PowerPoint? Amazing. Okay, so thank you all so much for being here today. I'm so excited to share not only my research, but my very non-traditional path and everything that led me to being a scientist in training today. So where I am today, the point of this is to illustrate where I am, and then the very long, windy path of how I got here. So I am currently about to graduate with my master's in neuroscience at UT Dallas. I am a graduate research assistant in Dr. Ben Kolber's lab at UTD in the Center for Advanced Pain Studies. I am an incoming neuroscience PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is super, super exciting. I'm starting in the fall. I am the co-director of the Intercollegiate Psychedelics Network. I have won awards now for my psychedelic research. I present, I advocate, I do all the things. I am a mental health advocate, which we'll get into what that picture is later. I am specifically an advocate for the International OCD Foundation, and I am a board certified mental health peer specialist. And I'm about to turn 27. This is what my life looks like right now, but that is not where I started, nowhere near how my adult life or my journey to being a scientist started at all. So where I started, this is kind of a point of, the fork in the road right there. So this was me in 2016. I was 20 years old. That's a picture from my passport because I don't have very many pictures of that time, but that kind of encapsulates a lot of where I was at that time. I was 2 years into college. I had started at UTD, my bachelor's in psychology. I did not function at all. I barely could go to school. I could barely go to class. I was completely financially self-sufficient because I was independent from my family. So the only thing I really could do is work just enough to be able to survive. But I was just completely debilitated. I could barely get out of bed. And I really didn't think about life further than immediate survival mode. And that resulted in, after 2 years of trying my undergrad and trying to go to class, trying to function, but not understanding why nothing was working for me, I dropped out with a 1.83 GPA. And that picture right there is just an encapsulation of what my life looked like. I got an F trying to take a neuroscience class as a psychology undergrad. I went to probably 3 weeks of class and then gave up. And what I did not know at the time as to why I was struggling so much and why I was so debilitated was a whole list of things that have been undiagnosed and untreated at that time. Hugely, I had severe obsessive compulsive disorder and severe post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and eating disorder, lots of other things. I also had many undiagnosed chronic illnesses and autoimmune diseases. And kind of the picture of why I was undiagnosed for so long was because I had, grown up with a lack of access to proper medical care. And I really just had no idea what was going on. I was barely hanging on by a thread, but I didn't know that at the time. I just kind of thought that that's what life was like. I thought it was generally suffering. And what I internalized from being in such a debilitated place, being so dead inside, was that I'm just not capable of anything. I probably shouldn't even be in school. And I really just need to try to make it by. And I just can't do school. And being in talking to the Aspiring Scientist Coalition right now, being a scientist myself, I never in a million years thought that I would ever be a scientist, that I would ever be studying anything. And I mean, in high school and middle school, like really when I started going downhill, I had this paradox of being quote unquote naturally gifted and being in the gifted programs for being able to score in certain ways on tests. But there was no way I could actually retain knowledge or actually pay attention in class. I barely, got by biology, physics. Oh my gosh. To this day, I'm like, I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to learn physics. I just never thought being a scientist was a thing I would do. And I want to say that I never had an interest, but that's not true because I've always been a very curious person and that's really what's carried me through to where I am now. But I had no way of acting on it because I was so debilitated by mental and physical illness. And I should also mention that part of this, I also was in a religious cult and I was just trying to get by. Life was really, really hard. And so I just share all that to explain how I got here. So after leaving college, after 2 years of just trying and failing miserably, the one thing I had going for me at the time was that I had perfect pitch and I had been singing and competing in music my whole life. And so I figured the one thing I could do was do music because I don't know anything else. And so I started another degree at Berklee College of Music to try to get a degree out of it. I really didn't know what I was doing, but I relied on my perfect pitch and I was able to pass classes with the little bandwidth I did have, given how sick and still undiagnosed and untreated I was. And I started playing shows and doing things like selling shows out at the House of Blues in Dallas. I was about to be on NBC's The Voice before things went downhill, as we'll get to. And I just included this picture because I don't know if anyone listens to Morgan Wallen, but fun fact, I opened for him a long time ago and now he's Morgan Wallen. So that's what I was doing from 20 to like 22 years old. And then at the end of 2018 / beginning of 2019, when I was 22, they first found a lump in my neck. I finally went to a doctor because I hadn't been to a doctor for a very long time and I was very sick, but didn't really know what was wrong with me. And initially I was misdiagnosed as just being sick and being young. And so they just thought my tumor was a lymph node and it was probably going to be okay. But then that lymph node never went down. And I ended up 6 months later getting diagnosed with metastatic thyroid cancer. And I went through surgery, I went through treatment, and amidst all of that, one of the interesting side effects that came of it was that my vocal nerves were damaged in the process. And one of the reasons that my vocal nerves was damaged in the process was because as they went in to do the surgery, it ended up taking an hour and a half longer than they expected because my thyroid gland was glued to everything around it, as they said. And that was because of apparently a lifetime's worth of scar tissue from having an undiagnosed autoimmune disease, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which explained a lot of my physical dysfunction and symptoms that I hadn't had diagnosed for such a long time. And so I ended up losing most of my vocal function at the time. I couldn't even speak for the first 3 months after my surgery. I was just whispering, and being in a drive-through trying to order coffee and whispering is not fun, if anyone was wondering. And I effectively just lost my identity. The one thing I thought I could do with myself, because I had failed out of school, for lack of a better term, the one thing I felt like I could remotely be good at was music. And then I couldn't sing anymore. And I didn't know what to do with myself. I was at a complete loss, but as a silver lining, because of going through cancer and also starting to uncover a lot of the physical dysfunction within me, I also started getting more intensive psychological treatment for, going through cancer at 22, and started uncovering some of the things that had been undiagnosed for so long. I had known that I had anxiety and depression, but I didn't realize that I had PTSD or OCD, and that a lot of the things I deemed to be just normal about myself were a foregone conclusion, like needing to sit on my hands so that I don't compulsively write every single thing down in class and then like lose my mind in case I don't hear one thing, like things like that. Maybe I was able to not do anymore. Maybe I actually could be present in class. Maybe I could actually, engage my interest in psychology, which is what I was doing at the time before I left school. And maybe I could, get a degree. And at this point, when I lost my voice and cancer happened, and I didn't know what to do with myself, the last thing I ever thought I was going to do was go back to UTD and finish that degree because of how horrible that had been. I was thinking of every other possibility of what I could do. That was the last possibility. But because of effectively getting a second chance at life and starting to gain some functionality back and becoming a person I didn't know I could be, I ended up trying to do the last thing I ever thought I would do. And so the beginning of 2020, right before the pandemic hit, I went back to UTD. It was the scariest thing I've ever done. And I put this picture in here just to illustrate, like, you can see in my face what it looks like before, when I was so sick versus starting to recover. I went back, and the first class I took, because I just like to go, off the deep end sometimes, I went back and took that same neuroscience class that I had initially failed after trying for 3 weeks and then just piecing out. And not only did I make an A, I made close to 100 in that class, which was only a reflection of the fact that I could actually be present and pay attention. And it completely blew my mind, because I was kind of using it as a litmus test. Like, can I actually finish this degree? Am I actually capable of this at all? And taking the hardest class possible and being able to pass it just truly changed my perception of what is maybe possible for my future. And I still at that point did not think I was going to become a scientist or a neuroscientist. We'll get there, but it really just changed my perception of what I could possibly do with my life. And so I also include this picture of me volunteering at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies conference in 2019, MAPS. And that's because I, at that time, started engaging my interest in psychedelic science and really looking into, what interested me as a person. Because being at that place in life where I was in such survival mode, I never really thought about, like, what do I like? What do I care about? What sets me on fire? Like, what do I want to do with myself? Because looking back, what I know now is, like, all I thought about was, am I going to live this second? Like, am I going to survive? It was a very day-to-day moment. There was nothing really like lighting me up or giving me interest, and finding my interest in psychedelic science really helped scaffold my very hard path to getting back into my undergrad. And then I ended up finishing my undergrad, which was something, again, I never thought I would do, especially at that school. And not only did I do that, but that GPA that was a 1.83, I returned back to the same school. So I still had a 1.83 when I started. And I was able to retake almost all of the classes. There was this arbitrary rule that came in that if you got, if it was anything above a C in that in a class, you can't retake it. And so I couldn't take some of I took a guitar class my first time I went to college, and I made like a C plus. And so therefore I couldn't retake it, that type of thing. But the vast majority of classes I was able to retake. I made straight A's. I brought my GPA up to a 3.517, which, yeah, it's not a 4.0, but compared to a 1.83, that was massive for me. I graduated, and then I, at the time, thought that if I was going to do anything academically or just, pursue any interest of mine with psychology, then I had to become a clinical psychologist, because I didn't think I was capable of anything else. And I was so interested in, for many reasons, including research, our minds and understanding, like, what drives our behavior, what drives our maladaptive behavior, and so much, pathology that can debilitate us. I had been a living example to myself of what pathology can do and how treatment and recovery can just effectively turn me into a completely different person. So I just wanted to study and understand why, because I knew how debilitating it was for me and the people I love. And so I thought the route to that would be psychology, but through my undergrad and taking that neuroscience class, I started realizing that even through doing some of the research I did, which in undergrad during the pandemic was very hard, but I did psychological research and, worked with psychometric testing and things like that in relation to diagnoses. I loved doing it, but I kept asking the question in my mind, but why? But why? But why? And I realized that the answers I was looking for really lied more so in the system, cellular, molecular side of, understanding the nitty gritty of our behavior and really bridging that to the human experience. And so I knew that, and I knew that I loved it and understood it. And that's all I thought about. And that's all I looked up. And I felt so invigorated, but I didn't really conceptualize or think of maybe I could do that with myself, because I still felt really, really stupid and incapable. And I hadn't really had a model or example or support of showing me that I was capable, except for one person, which was my husband, who heard me talk about these things all the time and really just saw me in a different way than I saw myself and encouraged me to explore my interests. So the reason I put this picture here is because as I was getting ready to graduate with my undergrad, I had applied to clinical psychology programs, and I ended up having some opportunities to go to some. And one of the letter writers I asked was one of my neuroscience professors, who is an MD, PhD, and has experience with both clinical and neuroscience work. And so when I asked him for a letter, he said, "Well, are you applying to neuroscience programs?" I said, "No." And he was like, "Why not? You clearly love it." I said, "I don't think I could do that." He was like, "Well, give one chance to that. If you apply to one program, then I will write you your letter." And so because of that, I applied to UTD's master's program. I felt like it was more accessible. And I also kind of just didn't think I would get in. So it was an easy bet. Just, hey, I'll apply. I won't get in. I'll just go to a clinical psychology program. It'll all be good. But lo and behold, I ended up getting into the program. And so I was faced with the choice of, do I go the clinical psychology route, or do I try to explore neuroscience in this master's program? And worst case scenario, I realize I can't do it, and then I'll just go back to trying clinical psychology. And I'm so glad that something within me prompted me to go with the neuroscience master's program, do the harder thing in my mind, because that's where I really found myself. I started my master's program. I started working I went all the way down the deep end and started working in Dr. Ben Kolber's lab, in a wet lab, in a system, cellular, molecular neurobiology lab. And it was the best thing that has ever happened to me, because I was taken into a whole new world of exploration of questions that I didn't even know like you could answer within psychiatric illness, and just learning how to do research in that way. And I found myself in that. And so since I started my master's, I have been working in Dr. Kolber's lab, and I've been getting so much experience that way. And something else that happened that's very non-traditional of my path, as you can see, I do things very weirdly, is I started my master's program in August of 2021, so almost 2 years ago. And a few months into that program, like I had mentioned before, I was very interested in psychedelic research, psychedelic assisted therapy, kind of the state of where research was at the time. And so I was really keeping up with MDMA assisted therapy, which, just as a brief primer, is MDMA refers to, Ben can speak to this at large. It is referred to oftentimes as ecstasy or Molly, but in the case of clinical trials and what's being explored right now, MDMA assisted therapy is being looked at for PTSD treatments. It's in phase 3 trials and is estimated to be approved for PTSD treatment in the next year or so, which is really exciting. And so I'd been keeping up with the research. I was very excited. And then I started thinking about the fact that I have PTSD, like we talked about, and I also have OCD. And a part of my journey that really informed a question I had was, OCD is really misunderstood. It's really misdiagnosed and takes a long time about 14 to 17 years on average to receive a proper diagnosis and treatment. And so that really played out for me, because I started getting proper OCD treatment like when I was 23 years old, and I started exhibiting symptoms as early as 4 years old. So that was a very long time. And I, in this little timeline, kind of show that I was first diagnosed with some illnesses in 2010, but not OCD or PTSD. I then started receiving incorrect treatment for OCD around when I was 21 or 22 years old. Then I started receiving PTSD treatment, and it was seemingly ineffective, and they couldn't tell why. then realized that my OCD wasn't actually getting better from the treatment I thought was working, and started to do research and realized that there's only one evidence-based treatment for OCD called exposure and response prevention. And in my own life, going through that proper treatment, I learned through personal experience and the research that having OCD and PTSD is not great, because oftentimes they become functionally dynamic and related, which we'll get into later. And their treatments work inversely, such that OCD treatment can make PTSD worse, and PTSD treatment can make OCD worse. And it's highly comorbid, to where in PTSD populations, up to 40% of people are also diagnosed with OCD, which is very wild, considering generally the OCD prevalence rate is 1 to 3%. So taking all of that comorbidity and the fact that these treatments work inversely, I started thinking about myself in the situation of, what if I went through MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, how would that consider my comorbid OCD in that situation? And what started as just this question I had in my mind for myself, and kind of bringing my own lived experience and then taking my research hats, starting to go down the rabbit holes of all the literature, I realized that this whole concept of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD effectively did not consider comorbid OCD, and could have a lot of negative consequences to people who have both. And so I didn't really know what I was doing. I was very ignorant to the process of, publishing work. This was like, again, right when I had started my master's in neuroscience, and I was just really, really ignorant to the process. And I happened to see that there was an abstract, there was a call for abstracts for a special topics journal on the topic of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. And I figured, okay, I have this idea, like maybe I can write a paper on it, which, if you know anything about research, you know that it's not usually just a master's student writing a paper on their own with no senior author or no mentor or anyone to do it with them. But I was ignorant to that. And maybe that ignorance served me well, because I wrote up an abstract, pulled it out of my head, submitted it to this journal, and then somehow got that abstract accepted to publish in that journal, which at that point I was like, what does that even mean? I started realizing the reality of what it was I was putting myself into. And at the same time, though, given that a journal would accept my little old idea, I realized maybe there's actually something here. Maybe I need to actually explore this, and I need to, bring on people who can help me explore this question, or just do it by myself and then bring it to people later. And maybe this isn't just an idea, maybe this is an actual research project. And so one of the first steps after getting that abstract acceptance was I applied to a program, a conference called psychedelic, which is a student talk conference from the Intercollegiate Psychedelics Network. And basically what happens is they want to platform students with ideas and help them develop those ideas into a talk that can be accessible and that can help spearhead their own research projects. So very much for people who are independent like me, or even have mentors, but just want to support students in this process. So I applied literally probably 5 minutes. I tend to apply to everything this way, 5 minutes before it's due, in bed, on my phone, procrastinating till the very end because I'm afraid of rejection. But I ended up applying. I somehow ended up getting accepted, which was amazing. And I really had no expectations of that, other than maybe I will learn how to talk about this idea. I'll realize how stupid it is, and then I'll move on with my life. But that's not what happened. I went through the process. I was mentored by a talk coach. His name is Victor Acero. He is incredible. And he really helped me feel empowered to share my thoughts, and really gave me validation for my ideas and helped me frame it into a 20-minute talk, which was really hard, but it was so rewarding. And not only did I get to present it and be a part of this conference, but it was judged by PIs and researchers doing this research from all over the world. And somehow they ended up picking me as the winner of the conference, which really just changed my life in so many ways, because this went from being just an idea in my mind to being validated by the very people doing the research, even though it went against some of their own findings, or might have, been a plot hole in what they were doing. And so that really just opened my eyes, and the people around me, the different mentors I had at UTD who do none of this research whatsoever, but were watching me do this on my own, and started showing me that maybe I should really pursue this, and I should really take this to the very traditional academic way of presenting research and flesh this out and make a difference with this research. And I just wanted to include this comment here, because that is really the driving force for why I've done this project and why I do anything. It's basically someone commenting on the video saying that they had no idea about this comorbidity and about the fact that they were dangerous to this treatment without the proper access and care and understanding of the comorbidity, and that it kept them from going down a treatment that could have possibly been ineffective and harmful for them. And so that really drives me to continue. And beyond any award or anything else I'm about to share, it's just a testament to what someone can do, someone like you, someone like me, if they set their mind to something and really not letting fear keep them from doing their research and making a difference. So after presenting my psychedelics talk last summer, I went on a rampage of presentations. And so I first presented this at the International OCD Foundation Research Symposium. I then presented it at the Psychedelic conference, which I presented, and I won a travel award for this, as well as an outstanding presentation award from the conference. I presented it at Society for Neuroscience and won an award for that. I presented it at the UT Dallas Supporting Outstanding Academic Research Poster Symposium. And something that's about to happen, I'm about to be giving a talk at Europe's largest psychedelic conference called Breaking Convention. I'm about to fly to London tomorrow for that, which is super exciting, and also received a travel award for that. And the reason I shared all of this here is because, again, this is all from a project that I just thought of in my head, bridging my lived experience to starting to think like a researcher from my education and my training. And with ignorance, and for better or for worse, with just kind of going for it as a sole author, this was possible for me. And if this is possible for me, this is possible for anyone who has an idea, especially given my background and that I don't fit into the traditional mold of a scientist or someone with a trajectory, oftentimes being judged for your grades as an undergrad, or, being a much older undergrad. So yeah, sole author. I still don't know how this happened. I feel like, honestly, did I just trick every conference into accepting me? I don't know, but it worked out and it's cool. And I even, like, a lot of the PIs who I met at these conferences who ended up which really influenced getting into grad school for me, as I'll get into, the comment I'd always get is like, I've never seen a sole author poster before that's not a senior author or a PI. And I was like, I know. So it's possible. And I didn't know that. And most people around me didn't know that. So now you know it's possible and you can do it too. And from all of that, from finishing my bachelor's, starting my master's, going and doing all the research I've been doing in the lab, all of the wet lab experiments, really getting mentorship and training there, as well as this other side project that was completely independent that now I'm working on writing a paper and bringing on experts who study comorbid PTSD and OCD to help scaffold that paper and make it the best it is. I am starting grad school in the fall, starting grad school again at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who has a neuroscience training program, and they are one of the oldest institutions who've done psychedelic research. They have that's the only school that I applied to that I have too many mentors to choose from. I'm like, I don't even know how I'm going to rotate in this situation and how to pick. It's so exciting. And the reason I share this too is because looking at me on paper, you would never have thought that I would end up in a neuroscience PhD program. For anyone here who, has gone through it or has applied, how hard it is to put yourself through that process and to really condense your research and your story into an application that they might even consider to be something competitive or something that they would extend an interview to you for. And I truly went in thinking I'm not going to get in anywhere. This isn't going to happen, but I'm just trying this anyway so I can not regret not applying later. And magically it happened. And that's another example of, if it's possible for me, it's possible for you too. And not only that, but going from having a 1.83 GPA in undergrad when I had left school, I have a 4.0 as a master's student. And that's not because of anything other than being able to actually be present and apply myself and my mind and have the privilege of being in recovery and being in treatment and not being even nearly fully recovered and still struggling massively, but being able to just move forward in life. And that makes a huge difference. And I just included that picture because Madison's beautiful and I met my friend there and it made me really happy. And this leads me to kind of what my life looks like now, which is living at the intersection of so many things. Of course, research and mental health advocacy, science communication, having my podcast, and being a mental health peer specialist. So I have my podcast, like Ben mentioned so kindly. It is a podcast that really strives to bridge the gap of research to the people who really care about it, the people in the lived experience communities, and making things accessible, and also just having a space to be open and honest. Because if nothing else, I don't have a filter and I am just really honest about my lived experiences in academia and in life in general, and talking about the realities of having mental illnesses and it not being something that's taboo or stigmatized, and really making the point that we deserve to be here and be scientists and do these things, not in spite of who we are, but because of who we are. And so this is my radical way of putting myself out there as my full self and having all those conversations in one place. I've also been doing a lot of advocacy and doing a lot of speaking and just really bringing awareness to a lot of these topics. I got to speak as keynote speaker at CancerCon last year, talking about mental health peer support. I, like I said before, am an advocate for the International OCD Foundation, which is really scary and awesome because I get to advocate in so many ways, bringing a lot of my science background to the advocacy. So I can bring a lot of the evidence-based resources and ways of understanding mental health, but from the perspective of someone who has it. It's kind of scary though, because, well, I think from all of this, if you Google me, you can immediately see I have mental illness, and that is a stigma and a reality that I live with and I choose to. Nonetheless, that is something, an actual consideration in this day and age where there's still sometimes internalized biases and stigmas against people who are open about their illnesses or having disabilities or anything like that. We're going to get into what this picture means later, but I have been I've had the honor and privilege of being an advocate in a very public way by being in the first set of nationally airing OCD commercials, which is another very obvious way of saying, hello, I have mental illness and I'm a scientist, and that's okay. I'm also a mental health peer specialist, which for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a new line of mental health work within the field to really bridge that gap of lived experience and clinicians. And it serves as another avenue of bringing your lived experience to becoming a certified professional by your state and being able to work in mental health facilities and be a part of someone's treatment team and advocate for some people who can't advocate for themselves when they're in the thick of mental illness. So I do that as well on the side. And some really cool ways of bringing all of my backgrounds together. I'm starting to really just build panels and build advocacy and awareness about the research going on, not only on my podcast, but in conferences to the people who care. And so something that's really exciting that's coming up is that I am presenting a panel with Dr. Carolyn Rodriguez at Stanford, Dr. Ben Kelmendi, and Dr. Terrence Chang, and Dr. Chris Pittenger at Yale, who are all doing psychedelic and OCD research. And we're getting to take all of the things that live in academia and in papers and bring that to the public in a way of really sharing the realities of research and psychedelics and OCD and all of the things that are floating around in the media right now, and bring it in a very scientific, evidence-based way to those who care about it, which are people with OCD and clinicians who are treating it. So I just really live at the intersection of bringing all of my backgrounds together, and there's really no separating the two for me. And for now, I think it's working out. And even if it's not, that's just who I am. And if anything, I get to pave my own path in doing that. And so something I really wanted to share with y'all is the commercials, which they have not been publicly available anywhere except for if you watch them on a commercial. So it's really exciting that I get to play them for you. But these are the OCD commercials. And this also is an amazing opportunity for you to learn some about what actually OCD is, because there's so many stigmas and myths around OCD. People think it's a quirk or an adjective, and oftentimes use it to say, I'm so OCD about like cleaning, or I'm so OCD about things being even. And they, we never say things like, I'm so PTSD about, or I'm so cancer about, or I feel so cancer right now, right? But OCD has faced that rampant misrepresentation and misunderstanding. And because of that, people like me didn't get diagnosed properly for so many years, because we have this impression of OCD, if you even think it's a disorder, being like hand washing all the time or being afraid of getting contaminated, which is one of many versions of what OCD can look like in a person. So the implications of not understanding what OCD actually is, about 14 to 17 years on average to get proper treatment. And it's in the top 10 most debilitating illnesses in the world, as ranked by the World Health Organization, not mental illnesses, all illnesses. And so that just illustrates the importance. And so these commercials are something I got to be a part of, really much at the intersection of my science and my advocacy. They're done by OCD advocates and a company named Biohaven Pharmaceuticals, which studies novel therapeutics for OCD. And without further ado, here are the commercials. You might recognize a certain person in there.
What if is a symptom that torments individuals with OCD?
What if everyone hates me?
What if I'm a fake?
What if I get in trouble?
What if I'm contaminated?
What if I'm not good enough?
What if I'm always going to be like this?
What if these thoughts never stop?
What if it's my fault? I hate my intrusive thoughts, but they are not who I am.
What if research brings hope?
There's a new clinical trial investigating a potential treatment for OCD.
See if you qualify.
What if is a symptom that torments individuals with OCD?
What if I act on a scary thought?
What if I'm immoral?
What if I'm a fake?
What if I bring COVID home to my family?
What if I committed a sin?
What if I'm a bad mom?
What if I accidentally ruin my life?
I hate my intrusive thoughts, but they're not who I am.
What if research brings hope?
There's a new clinical trial investigating a potential treatment for OCD. See if you qualify.
What if is a symptom that torments individuals with OCD?
What if I hurt someone and forgot?
What if I get everyone in my family sick?
What if I upset somebody I love?
What if there's a fire because of something that I left on?
What if I said something offensive?
What if I left the door unlocked?
What if I'm not perfect?
I hate my intrusive thoughts, but they're not who I am.
What if research brings hope?
There's a new clinical trial investigating a potential treatment for OCD. See if you qualify.
What if is a symptom that torments individuals with OCD?
What if I said something offensive?
What if I offended people I care about?
What if I wrote something inappropriate?
What if I'm an imposter?
What if my thoughts are dangerous?
What if I'm a horrible person? What if I never feel just right? I hate my intrusive thoughts, but they're not who I am.
What if research brings hope?
There's a new clinical trial investigating a potential treatment for OCD. See if you qualify.
So those are the commercials, and they really just illustrate the reality of OCD and what obsessions actually look like. It's not obsessions like I'm so obsessed with Taylor Swift or I'm so obsessed with whatever. In the context of OCD, obsessions are debilitating, intrusive thoughts that are ego dystonic, that people don't want to be thinking. And they do physical and mental compulsions to have to deal. And logic and reason doesn't work for it. And why that's so important to me to share with you all today is because of how much that had debilitated me and rendered me ineffectual in my life. And recovery from that is why I can be here. I'm still in recovery. There's still a long process, but I've come such a long way, and other people deserve to too. And that's also why I get to go to grad school and study exactly that, study the neurobiological basis of OCD and potentially what psychedelics can do to engage with the different circuits that are involved with OCD and just really further that understanding, because we all deserve healing and treatment. So that really shapes my own journey and being here. I'm a scientist who cares about research, and that's okay. And so I also just wanted to talk about from my whole journey, like what has made such a big difference in being a non-traditional student, being so by traditional societal standards. I don't subscribe to them, but they exist. Being so behind and being so different from other people and having so much to catch up on and being so new to lab work and somehow still becoming a competitive applicant for grad school amongst people who've been doing research since they were 13 years old. Those people actually exist, by the way. And one of the biggest parts of it has been mentorship. So that's my PI, my mentor, Ben. That's a shirt I made him because he doesn't drink water. He only drinks Coke Zero. And he has been such a massive influence to me, him and my postdoctoral mentor, Keisha, who happened to work with Ben. I did not know that. And both of them together in my lab have made such a big difference in supporting me, not only in the work I do in the lab, but everything I've done outside the lab that they know virtually nothing about because that's not their field of research. We study the amygdala and chronic pain in the lab. And I chose that lab for the mentorship above everything else because I knew that in doing something so scary and so unbelievable to me that I needed people who could support me being so scared and being so behind and not having the traditional biological basis of understanding from my undergrad that other people did and being older than most people in the lab. And they just took me under their wing and believed in me and relentlessly just held hope and faith for me when I didn't have that for myself. I used to come home from the lab like sobbing every single day, thinking I needed to quit my degree, needed to quit this lab. I can't understand anything. And now those very same things that I didn't believe I could do are second nature to me. And I am terrified of all the things I'm going to have to learn to continue to train as a scientist. But them believing in me and offering me such kind support just made the biggest difference. And so I would encourage anybody on a non-traditional path, anyone in general, to really seek mentorship from people who you can trust, who you feel safe with, who challenge you, but also believe in you and validate you for who you are and being different. And also receiving mentorship and community from not only the people in my lab, but from peers. And I found so much of that in the friendships and the mentorship I received from the Intercollegiate Psychedelics Network, meeting people who were so intimidating to me, who are getting their PhDs at really prestigious universities that are doing research that I could never even dream of, and them really taking me under their wing and just talking to me like a human and being kind and validating my experiences and empowering me to feel like research is not this unattainable goal that only, elite people who were privileged can attain. It can be anybody if you put your mind to it and you believe in yourself and you continuously challenge yourself and you receive the support for the things that you're genuinely struggling with. And so that community and mentorship, and then just trying and being kind of ignorant in my trying sometimes. Like, had I known that sole authorship posters are not a thing, that people generally don't get accepted to publication as a sole author, like I would probably have never tried, but just trying and seeing where life can take you. And there are so many rules and things within the system of academia and research and science that people accept as a foregone conclusion. And of course, some of them do matter and exist for a reason, and other things are meant to be broken and to explore and to see what you can do and to perhaps forge a new path. Like, I had the ability to show people around me at my university, the people who had never seen a sole author poster, that is possible, and receive support from them. And so that is me ending my diatribe on my entire experience. I would love to connect with you anywhere, and I'm super happy to answer any questions from y'all. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Uma. I really appreciate everything you shared, and it's extremely inspiring. It's extremely just amazing in general. I'm not sure what the word is that I'm looking for. It's like surprising, I suppose, and I think that's part of the value is that, like, even you've been surprised by the transformation you've made over the last couple of years, even, since your early struggles and now all the success that you're having. And I think that is just so immensely valuable for students to see, and for, of course, everyone to see. But for those who are particularly early in their career and face many of these same sort of, fears and trepidation about, can I really do this? Am I cut out for this? I think we've all experienced that to some level. I think I can relate to it, but yeah, your story is just amazing. And so I thank you again. I will open the floor for anyone to ask questions in the chat, but I do have some questions to get us started. You have some really, really kind comments in the chat. Someone messaged me privately and said she's a great public speaker and relatable also. But I'll start with this question, kind of piggybacking off of what I just said. I had a similar experience to what you described, where in undergrad, I knew I wanted to study neuroscience, but I had a lot of struggles. I found that I really couldn't keep up when it came to learning about like molecular signaling cascades and all the, intense biochemistry, molecular biology stuff. I also struggled with, learning to do animal research, which is what I now do involving mice. And it's just really challenging. It's technically challenging. It's ethically challenging. And I had these huge fears and I just was afraid to jump in. But when I did jump in, I found the same thing that you found, that when push comes to shove, I was capable of doing it, and I was able to succeed. And so I'm curious if you have any comments about like your first experience in undergrad, and then when you went back, like what was the main difference? Like, what do you think propelled your success? Was it an attitude change? What was it?
Oh, there's so much in there. And everything you said, by the way, I really relate to. And I just want to say that I feel like it's not just me, but anyone who's hearing you share your struggles, being someone who we all look up to and on the outside looks like, you have it all together and you're doing the most amazing research at the coolest place. Like, the fact that you normalize that, just thank you for that, because I hear that from most people and we should all know that it's not, multiple things can be true. So thank you for that. And for me, I think there was a few things going in, and some of them are more specific to me, but I think can be generalized to anyone who struggles with, I suppose, psychiatric illness or physical illness. But literally, number one, looking back, was physically and psychologically incapable of functioning beyond what I was at the time. And there's so much shame embedded in that. And I think has made my journey now really difficult, because I keep going to that mentality of that's who I was then and that's still who I am now. And I failed by the standards of classes so miserably then that I can very much fail now. And so while the psychiatric part of the physical part of it all might be very internalized to me, I think what people can relate to in general is being in a different part of their life and for whatever reason engaging in things that ended up failing or not going the way they wanted to, and really taking those beliefs and generalizing them to themselves, that I am always going to be this way. I am a failure. Life is always going to be hard and I can never do it, to really having a mentality of failure is learning. And I know that sounds so corny and cliche, and you've probably heard this before, but really like taking that to my heart and reminding myself in those moments of fear and shame and, almost on the brink of relapse, like when I'm thinking of like when I went back to school and being in that same neuroscience class, and I was more able to be present, but if I didn't understand one thing, just going down so many loops of shame, like I'm so stupid, I can't do this. Why am I even here? Who the hell do I think I am? And, letting them happen, because suppressing thoughts doesn't necessarily help, but then also remembering like by being here and by trying is how I'm going to learn, no matter how hard it is. And it's okay that it's hard. We can do hard things. That is probably the only reason why I can keep moving forward, because things have not gotten easier, in the sense that, things that were really hard for me, that if that were impossible, things that you talked about that you had a hard time wrapping your head around, now they're easy and you just do them. But then new things become hard. Like every level that you go to, every new experience you have, there's just a new challenge. And I think I just had to stop waiting for when it would get easy, and not to say, maybe it will get easier, but just not waiting for that, and just being okay with, okay, now this is just the next hard. I've shown myself I can do hard things. Making this presentation, I was like, wow, I guess I can do hard things, like really having to reflect on that in my past. And I can continue to do hard things, whether that is. And then I think there's also the element of, is this the hard thing that I want to do, or do I not need to do it? And I wonder what your thoughts are on that too, because clearly you've moved forward with all the things that you said were so hard and difficult for you. And there's a decision in that of it was worth trying anyway, versus, for example, with animal research, like it's really hard. Maybe it's not for me. Maybe I won't do it. I think there's that tension of making the right decision in that space. And to that, I would say, like, if it feels hard and it feels difficult and it feels aversive, if your values like guide you towards it too, like, this is hard and difficult, but I do want to figure this out, or I do want to try because I really want to study this thing. I really want to make a contribution to this field, then listen to that, versus if you're not getting anything out of it too, then maybe don't do it.
Yeah. Great Great points. I mean, there's common themes that seem to often come up in these ask meetings, which two of them you just hit. One is what you just said about how if you are motivated to do something because it means a lot to you, it's going to be a lot easier to accomplish than if, it's different when you're like, oh, I'm forced to take this physics class next semester and I'm afraid that it's going to be tough. I mean, chances are when you step foot in the class, it's probably going to be tough, but if you're like, oh, I really, really want to learn about developmental biology, but it's so complicated, but like, I need to take this class if I want to get into this master program that's going to help me advance my career, you're probably going to get to that class and realize, okay, this actually isn't that bad. I feel like when there's a deeper motivation behind taking on those challenges, that's when you can really kind of unlock your abilities and your skills and discover what you excel at that you may not have expected to. Because frankly, I mean, personally, at the end of the day, I think that people's sort of skills and talents and things that they like to do are all like completely intertwined. If you're good at something, you're going to enjoy that thing. Mm-hmm. And so especially if it's something that's really typically challenging and you can find that you have like this sort of niche expertise, I think that's where a lot of satisfaction comes. But the other thing that's extremely important and also comes up is that it's entirely okay and actually strongly encouraged to show your vulnerabilities and your any disparities there that exist between your understanding and what you feel you should understand. Basically, in other words, ask questions when you're an undergrad, because I think if undergrad students are in this position where it's like you're trying to sell yourself constantly, right? You're trying to sell yourself to research labs. Please let me gain experience. You're trying to sell yourself to graduate programs, and you're trying to build yourself up. And so it can become scary to show, hey, I actually don't understand this really basic concept that I maybe should understand. And so what a lot of people will do is they'll just hold on to that misunderstanding and be too afraid to bring it up, when really the best thing you can possibly do is surround yourself with good mentors and a good support system, like you said, so that you can feel comfortable asking those questions. And the people who are not afraid to ask questions and show, hey, I don't understand this, those people, in my experience, they tend to go further because it's just a valuable skill, and being able to address those misunderstandings before they get in your way is really critical. So
that's so important. And that just makes me think of something that was really pivotal for me on my path, which was, well, number one, I asked a ton of questions and I used to be like shamed for it growing up. So I learned that was something wrong with me, but I still do it anyway, because I'm trying to, get somewhere with myself. And most of the time when I ask questions, I've gotten the response of, that's actually a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. Or, you ask really good questions and it's asking something fundamental that I feel like I'm stupid for not knowing. But in reality, it's something that people haven't considered yet, which is, you have no idea what your question means. You're either going to learn something or you're going to spur on some sort of discovery or conversation with other people. And at my first research symposiums last year, particularly the International OCD Foundation Research Symposium, it was my first one ever. I'd never been to one. I kind of didn't know like the protocol of how that works and how, whatever, but I was sitting next to a mic and there's supposed to be questions at the end of every presentation. So I would get on that mic and I would ask a question every single time, as embarrassed as I was. And I started realizing that other people weren't doing that. And maybe there's something wrong with me. And I'm embarrassing myself in front of the experts in my field that I care about. But then afterwards, multiple of the PIs came up to me and told me that I asked amazing questions and they wanted to get to know me and support me in my path. And like it engaged so many collaborations, some of whom I'm presenting with now. And that just came from asking questions, even though I felt stupid. So please ask questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is no coincidence that the Aspiring Scientist Coalition spells out ask, because that's kind of the whole premise here is like, ask people questions, like Uma's here, ask her the questions that you have. And there was a question that came through to me privately, so I will never tell a soul who asked it, but they said, do you think having the physical and mental issues helped you understand and inspire you to keep going and boost your confidence in order to understand what you were experiencing?
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. And I think there's and I've started to learn this from just talking to other people who do this in the field, there's, especially in preclinical, like biology, like research, there's oftentimes such a gap between what you're studying and the actual people who experience it. And even if you are studying it from a preclinical model, like there's still so much value in understanding what it is you're studying. You can get so removed from it that you stop, asking relevant questions or thinking of unique ways of hypothesizing things because you're so, detached from the actual symptoms. And for me, I think the firsthand experience and care for the illnesses, first of all, keeps me motivated to continue amongst like all the fear, all the shame, all the tiredness through all of it. And also my entire research project came from me having comorbid PTSD and OCD and asking a fundamental question about, in MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD, is comorbid OCD being considered? And if so, how? And since the answer was no, and I developed an entire project from that literally just came from me experiencing those myself and then putting my research hats on and exploring that question as a researcher. And every time I presented it, I've been told that, like, how has this been missed? Like, how is this such a fundamental thing people haven't thought of? Maybe because they didn't think of it because they don't have it, or they're looking at it from just such a removed lens. So yes, I think so. And that's why I love telling people that you belong here, not in spite of who you are, but because of who you are, even if you're shamed for, being different, being open, having disabilities, having illnesses. Don't let that detract you. That makes you uniquely qualified and empowered. You should do it.
It's so funny because a lot of the time, I don't know, you brought up the term me search in your presentation. You had it written somewhere. And whenever I've heard people talk about me search in academia, it's generally like, sometimes people are like negative about it, right? It's like, you shouldn't do me search, but it's like, I completely agree with what you just said. Most of the time when scientists are studying a topic, the only understanding that they have about the topic is from what they've read in other academic journals, which was written by other scientists who only understand it from reading about it from other scientists. And it's like, at some point you need to introduce people who understand this on a human experiential level. And now I'm studying empathy, and I get to, once in a while, I experience empathy, and I'm like, let me just interrogate the neurobiological circuits that are activated right now. Like, what's going on here? But yeah, it's so important to understand that, and I do think it can absolutely generate hypotheses. Really, it can help guide your science, whether or not everybody wants to do that as a non-scientist. But there's another question. This is a more specialized, kind of specific question. So someone said, I'm on a similar path. This person has a bachelor's in neuroscience and a master's in social work, and they want to get a PhD in neuroscience, focusing on neurobiology and plant medicine. They ask, how can I gain more neuroscience research experience? Should I get a second master's degree in neuroscience?
I'm curious what your thoughts on this, but just from reading that, I mean, the fact that you already have a bachelor's in neuroscience, I mean, people that oftentimes apply to grad school, usually they have a bachelor's in neuroscience or something really closely related, and then have a good amount of research experience. And then, I mean, I have a master's because, number one, I didn't have a bachelor's degree in neuroscience. I did psychology. Number two, I had interesting grades. And so and number three, I wanted to learn about neurobiology personally. So that's why I did a master's. I don't think that's required at all. I think if anything, just getting research experience under your belt, working in a neurobiology lab, even better if it's happens to be a psychedelic lab, if that's what you're wanting to do, and then apply. And I think your social work master's can be super beneficial to give you a more well-rounded approach of understanding the human element, even if that's not what you want to study. I think that's amazing. And feel free to message me. I can talk to you more, but you sound great for this path.
Yeah, I agree. And I think my only thing I'd add is, like, I always look at everything very as strategically as possible, I suppose. And so it's like, it depending on what your future plans are for your career, if you want to do something that would require a master's degree, then absolutely go ahead and get the master's degree. But if you're just looking for research experience and you're not going to need a master's degree, then maybe you could get like a technician position where instead of paying for the research experience, you're getting paid for it. So think a little bit about, kind of what the career outlook is for you and how that could factor in. We have a hand up from Layla. If you want to ask your question, feel free to turn on your camera.
Hi. First of all, just thank you so much. I relate to, it's kind of scary. I relate to like almost everything that you kind of like shared. just how your life has unfolded. And in terms like I have OCD, I have CPTSD. And I never, until hearing now, I like just so many things, like so many light bulbs in my head. And I was like, wow, okay, I did not realize the correlation between the two as well. I'm right now in a grad program doing counseling somatic psychology. And I'm looking to apply for a PhD after for neuroscience. And you were mentioning that people who apply tend to have more like research experience, or maybe I don't have any background in neuroscience, but I'm just so fascinated in it, and especially once I got into psychology, just like I'm very much how you expressed it, like the person who's always asking like why. And I realized like just psychology doesn't always answer those questions. I have more of a science mind.
Yeah.
Like I want to understand, get to the root and get like into the details and stuff of it. So anyways, all that being said, how would you recommend getting that research? Because for my program, for example, we have to do a practicum. And I'm trying to see how can I use that opportunity to kind of get my foot into the neuroscience door.
That's a really good question. And so is your program like a license program right now?
Yeah, so once I finish, I'll be taking I'm doing the LPCC track.
Awesome.
So I'll have the MFT and the LPCC, and I'm actually looking to do my PhD at Stanford. I would love to work like at the Huberman lab specifically. He's like a big reason why I'm into neuroscience. Yeah, so I'm just trying to see like how like the best way get my foot in.
I guess what comes to mind if you're trying to maximize your practicum, it would be maybe getting into getting a mentorship, doing the practicum with a physician scientist who is like a psychiatrist who can, supervise you in some way with your licensure, and also has, a neurobiology element to their lab or work that you can also just do, not necessarily as a practicum, but be immersed in their research anyway. And if that doesn't work, then at the very least, after you're done with your practicum, just joining a neurobiology lab. Like from going through the ringer of grad school and getting in, like what seems to be the common denominator, no matter what your undergrad or even your grad degree is working in a lab as a technician or whatever, and learning everything you can and getting as much hands-on experience doing the experiments, doing all of that. And so, it depends on if you want to do imaging, then that might be a little easier with the physician scientist route. But regardless, just getting in a lab somehow and getting that experience, that is invaluable, and it's what they look for in the applications above everything else.
Okay, having that lab.
Mm-hmm. That's like the top thing, and like having those letters of recommendation from the mentors who you did your lab research with.
Do you know of any labs? Because my focus area is DMT, and DMT, I mean dance movement therapy. Yeah. Working with kids who have trauma, who come out of
not the DMT I thought of.
Not the DMT you thought of. That's why immediately I was like, wait, dance movement therapy. Like I come from a humanitarian aid background. I work with kids overseas. So that's kind of like the field. And I feel like it's so like specific. I don't know if there's any labs, or I haven't come across any labs or research centers that would incorporate that a little bit.
I don't know off the top of my head. I'm curious, Ben, if you have any ways of bridging that.
No, I certainly don't know of any labs. I mean, what I would recommend, Layla, is go to PubMed or Google Scholar, whatever your preferred index in your database search engine, and just search dance movement therapy and see what pops up. If there's publications, look at the author list, look at their affiliations, and if there are people who are doing this research and you're interested in the work they're doing, then just send them an email. I think that's like the easiest way to knock on a door in academia, right? Send an email. And unfortunately, because of the way academia works, you may not get a response, but it's always worth a shot. And I'd be kind of curious. And I also thought DMT as in the psychedelic stroke.
I mean, I'd be curious about that too, but okay. Thank you both so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So there are a few other questions actually in here that kind of, this last question goes right off of that, and I'm going to ask it because I also have thoughts on it. Do you think there's a difference between the way neuroscience understands the brain and psychology understands the brain? And Uma, we both come from psychology undergrads and transition. And as Layla was just saying, I feel similarly about this idea that my experience in psychology was more sort of observational and correlational, and neuroscience is much more, direct manipulation. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Oh, this question is like rabbit holes on end. So I guess to sum it up, and by the way, I love that we have that similar background, Ben, like that gives me a lot of joy. I look at it like two sides of the same coin, and they're probing from two different angles to meet in the middle. And I think a really good book about that topic actually is Projections by Carl Deisseroth. I think he does such a phenomenal job of like really toggling between like the complete patient experience, like phenomenologically, to like the cellular underpinnings and like or molecular cellular underpinnings and how they bridge together. I think I really enjoy neurobiology because I am so curious about the why, but then bringing it back to the human, and the observational personally, like it informs what I want to look at for more from a causational standpoint, which none of it's perfect, none of it's concrete, but they meet in the middle. So I think there's a difference in the way the research is done and the conceptualizations, but ultimately I think they're looking at the same thing. And I think the biggest example of that for me is going through OCD treatment in particular and doing exposure and response prevention therapy, or even going through PTSD treatment and doing things like EMDR or prolonged exposure and those types of psychotherapies. On the surface level, you might think like that is just, that's just therapy. It's just talking. But like the reality is it's really not talking. It's having to engage your fear response and then habituate in a new way and break patterns. And to me, I see so clearly what that's doing and on a circuit level, and like just doing that through behavioral interventions. And so that's to me the bridge of the experience and what that's doing to, these words are overused, but like retrain the brain effectively. So that's my spiel on that.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Like you said, it's two sides of the same coin, two approaches to the same questions. And and even within neuroscience, you can say it's almost like human fMRI studies, or observational studies for, let's say you're doing a clinical trial for depression and you have a standardized assessment for depression scores, right? Those studies versus like what Carl Deisseroth does, right? Flipping on a brain circuit and measuring whether the mouse spends more time around the outside of the perimeter of the box it's in because it's more anxious. Like those are entirely different ways of approaching the same questions as well, but they're both neuroscience. And yeah, one of the things that I've gained an appreciation for over the years is just that the techniques that you learn and the type of research that you do really just shapes the questions that you can ask, because it's like, what experimental approach can we use? Well, I only know how to do this one technique, so I have to ask the question that way. And so really science is just a conglomerate of everyone with using their particular skills to ask questions with the restrictions of the skill set that they have. So
exactly. The limitations and the advantages of each and every technique all coming together to try to comprehensively answer the question, even though it's not perfect.
Exactly. And it's useful and it's necessary, because then you could point, the mouse person can point at the human studies and say, hey, look, this is the same thing we found in the mice, and vice versa. And so it's like, okay, now we can start to piece everything together. And no one lab can study all of those things unless maybe they're Carl Deisseroth, who does seem to be able to do a lot. And I'm also reading Projections right now. I was looking around. I think it's on my kitchen table.
Oh my gosh. Me too.
Yeah, it's really good. We have a hand up. Please feel free to.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
Ben, it was so wonderful to hear you speak in the Yoga and Neuroscience conference. And that's what I'm interested in, where I want to get into an fMRI machine and sort of scan my brain to see what happens when I try out like different mudras or different yoga postures. And the reason I'm also interested in the neuroscience is to see how we can actually have modern medicine and yoga combined to actually get into the research from a way where we're able to prove the value of the ancient traditions that yoga brings in, and also how it can be used for trauma work. Like, I'm really interested in psychology aspect of it. And like Layla, I'm also doing a master's in somatic counseling psychology. And I am super, super excited to even witness this presentation today and see the amount of opportunity that we can have as non-researchers, but to be able to get into that research. And my question for you is basically to just understand, when it comes to trying to do independent research, what are things that you would say is required when you're sort of setting like your research methodology, and what's the basis that you would set for yourself and to try and do that on your own before you even enter a lab?
That's a really good question. And I guess that inspires me to clarify that my research was the way I guess it's technically, they call it a systematic review, but like really it was me taking a question and looking at all the literature out there and kind of it like related to different facets of the disciplines I was looking at to answer my question, and then taking that literature and analyzing it through my own perspective. And so for that, while you're not collecting your own data, which I think it is possible to do independently, but it's far harder and has totally different considerations that I can't necessarily speak of. But in terms of taking what does exist and, interpreting it and bringing it together in a way other people haven't done so, I would say just having a really high standard of rigor for yourself. And also, this is something Ben talks about a lot, but like having the humility to admit when you don't understand something and then go take the time to understand it. And so for me, going into the pharmacology of MDMA and the neurobiological basis of OCD and the current treatments that all exist and understanding clinical trials and research design and all of those things, like I don't do any of that in my lab. I have the skills to, I've developed and learned the skills to read papers and to have the background understanding to engage with those topics, but I have not actually gone to like a lab or a class that taught me like how OCD works in the brain. Like I had to try to go learn and teach that myself, and also ask questions to people when all else failed and I couldn't teach myself. But it required so much humility, and especially as someone who has so much shame and perfectionism and stuff, it was really hard. But just really sticking it out and being okay with not knowing and seeking out people to help you. And people are so helpful. Like as much as people are, in the research field are so busy and overextended and tired, like when you're engaging with their research, like they oftentimes will respond. So it's worth reaching out to, as Ben said, like going into PubMed, reaching out, like looking at papers. If you don't understand something or you have questions about their whatever, like, reaching out to the first author or to the PI, and maybe they will answer, and just really having that humility and that determination. That's all I can really say about that. And then that methodology evolves over time. That this project has unfolded and become more and more robust over time. And that has also come from engaging with other people to get more questions and realize that there's more things I can ask and more things I can expand upon. And so that's where I think the value of presenting your research wherever you can, at conferences, at posters, talks, whatever, to people who are familiar with different parts of your field, that really helps as well.
That is so helpful. Thank you.
Well said, Uma. I completely agree. Start with the literature. That's a great place to look, and it's also, this is one of the key lessons you learn as a scientist doing academic affiliated research. Is you have an idea, you're like, this is it, I'm going to win a Nobel Prize, and then you do a PubMed search and you're like, oh, someone published about this in 1976. It's like, it's devastating. So it's always important to start by looking at what exists, what's out there. Also, things tend to be moving recently in a direction of like open science and data accessibility. So some papers now, but perhaps more in the future, should offer you the ability to just actually go in and like play with the raw data and explore questions that they may not have looked at, that you may have a hypothesis about. So that's definitely the best place to start, is by just seeing what's out there.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Of course. And Layla, if you're still here and listening, I did a search for dance movement therapy. There are 1,215 results. I'm seeing papers on dance movement therapy for dementia, for Parkinson's disease, for trauma. There's a lab at UCLA that appears to be studying trauma. And actually, I'm just going to do a quick demonstration really quick for anyone whoever wants to do this. Can you see my thing here?
Yes.
My screen. Okay, yeah, I just want to, if anyone's ever interested in this, so let's say you do dance movement therapy, you click on this paper, you're interested in this one, or actually I'll go to the trauma one. Meta synthesis of qualitative findings about dance movement therapy for individuals with trauma. These are the two authors. You see this one and this two. So those are their affiliations, and you can just hit expand. And this is it. So they have affiliations at UC or University of Southern California, Los Angeles. And there's an email address if you wanted to contact this person. So this is how you would find someone's information if you were looking for their lab. And that's also just another skill that's like never really discussed.
TikTok idea.
Great idea. I could just take this. I don't have to do it anymore. I'll just film this and just upload it. That's a great point. So another question came in, and I know we're over time, so if people have to go, it's okay. But at this point, we're just chatting, really. Someone's asked anonymously, can y'all riff on the mechanisms that underlie treatment efficacy in MDMA-assisted therapy for OCD, how treatment protocol is designed, and perhaps, if Uma is willing, the phenomenology of treatment from her perspective? I'm also curious about, I don't know, I mean, I know MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD is happening, and there's these clinical trials that's looking really promising, and I'm curious what's out there for OCD and whether the approach is similar, and if you could talk about that.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with currently the state of psychedelic research for OCD in general is very small, but promising. And the current trials that I'm aware of that are underway are with psilocybin for OCD, not assisted therapy at this point, just psilocybin in a clinic and then seeing the outcomes, and then ketamine in various different forms, like in terms of the number of infusions and the dosage and things like that for OCD, also not assisted therapy as well. And there's a lot more caveats and things, but in terms of generally the way it's looking, it's seeming to be beneficial in the very limited end that they have right now. And they're looking at the causality, the reasons why. But in terms of MDMA itself for OCD, I believe that is going to be initiated by Dr. Carolyn Rodriguez at Stanford, one of the people I'm presenting with at the IOCDF. And we don't know what it's going to do for OCD. And so that's, I guess, one part of it. But really what I was looking at is in MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD, how is that taking into account comorbid OCD, given that 40% comorbidity in people? And how would that framework of MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD impact the comorbid OCD? So not just MDMA for OCD, but that specific treatment protocol. And why that's so important is because those clinical trials, that effectively that form of treatment, that package, if you will, is what's being pushed through the FDA as the standard of treatment for PTSD, MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD moving forward. Plus or minus, like it's going to be more, like you can add more sessions generally, like when it's through the FDA, because in trials you have to have it very like static and the same thing. But nonetheless, it's going to be pretty much that. And so what that entails is basically like intake sessions to prime people for the actual sessions and to also make sure that they're eligible for the trial and really screening people out for different comorbidities and disorders. And then and activating the engram of the different traumas, which is basically like having them engage with their memories of the trauma to like kind of prime them to be able to make them labile and, engage with them during the actual MDMA sessions. And then having in the clinical trial, 3 different sessions of MDMA assisted therapy, which means taking the MDMA in the clinic and then having like a 8-hour or however many hours it takes for the whole process to be done session of not only taking the MDMA, but going through active psychotherapy and treatment during that actual trip. And then also having integration sessions of being able to, reconcile with everything that came up and whatnot, which is not on MDMA. So with all of that being said, the way I approached this question was looking at, number one, are they even screening out for OCD in these trials? And the answer is no, they are not. They're like, of all of the screening protocols that they're using in terms of all of the like exclusionary criteria and the tests, none of it includes OCD, but it does include other disorders like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. And so they have thought about comorbidities, but they did not think about OCD. So that's step one. And then step two was in the actual psychotherapy, what's being conducted. And the main takeaway of that is all of the treatments that are happening for PTSD in that setting. Because again, it's not just the trip, it's also the treatments such as traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, psychodynamic therapy, EMDR therapy, and somatic processing. All of those, not only are they not helpful for OCD, but they're contraindicated for OCD. So they make OCD worse based on the literature. So now we have people who might be getting into this situation, not being screened out. And then in those treatment settings, they are effectively getting treatment that makes things worse for OCD. And why that's also problematic is, like we talked about before, OCD is highly underdiagnosed. People, up to 80% of clinicians misdiagnose OCD and don't understand what it is because they think it's like washing your hands all the time or having something very overt. And something very hallmark of OCD is something called mental compulsions. And so that's doing compulsions inside and doing things like mental review or rumination in a compulsive manner, or other, compulsive prayer and seeking certainty oftentimes. And that often looks like PTSD. So that, like, very much like mental compulsions can look like the safety behaviors in PTSD. And the differences are the function of those symptoms. And so when people have comorbid OCD and PTSD, a therapist who understands it will be able to parse out which of these are compulsions or which of these are safety behaviors for PTSD, because they're treated very differently, even if they look similarly. But in that situation, these people are not trained to be able to tell that. So they're going to treat them all like PTSD, even though they might be OCD. So people might be doing these treatments and then doing these mental compulsions, and people don't know that they're doing them. And it looks like they're getting better, but they're actually not. They're just reducing their anxiety slightly until the intrusion, the obsession comes back up again. So that's really concerning when there's a 40% comorbidity. And then basically, I'm rambling at this point, but after that, I did like a full pharmacological analysis of all of the things that we currently accept in the field or think we know about OCD pathophysiology, which there's a lot more we need to know. And then looking at the current treatments of what, is attacking those targets from the current treatments we have, and then looking at what we think we know about OCD or MDMA pharmacology, and are those things helping or hurting or neutral to what we know about OCD treatment. And for the most part, things look pretty okay, except for the fact that MDMA is showing to be an agonist of this receptor called, or these types of receptors called D2 receptors, which it's complicated, but in OCD treatment, sometimes D2 agonists can harm OCD, but it helps in other scenarios. And so it's confusing about that. And also it seems to increase glutamatergic signaling, but in OCD, glutamatergic signaling is part of the problem, and treatments right now are looking to decrease glutamatergic signaling. So there's a question, an open-ended question from the pharmacology standpoint. It's a lot more than that, but that's to sum it up. And then altogether, taking everything I just shared, part of what people are looking at with MDMA, and please, Ben, I want to hear your thoughts on this too, but part of what they're looking at with MDMA is the idea that why it might be so efficacious is because it reopens critical learning periods in people. And that's something that in biology, we didn't think we could do pharmacologically, but it's seeming to do so, which there's an idea that maybe MDMA treatment and MDMA therapy is not just the trip itself, but it's opening this state of being able to be more valuable to the treatments that they're receiving that they could maybe not do without the MDMA. And that could be all well and good, except for if they're receiving treatments that are harmful to their OCD, it can make their OCD worse. And so it's also, this is totally just like a side thought, but it's interesting that generally the efficacy rates of these treatments is around 60%. And then there's a 40% comorbidity rate. And so maybe one wonders how much of the lack of treatment, efficacy could be related to the fact that their OCD is getting worse and that they oftentimes become functionally entangled and dynamic. So there's a lot of more I could say, but I'll stop there. That was great. And really just like awesome, comprehensive summary of this entire topic in your paper. So sorry, there's messages coming through that I'm getting distracted reading. Just to summarize and kind of interpret and sort of share my interpretation, and you can tell me if you disagree or if you think this is wrong. My understanding of MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD is, like, as you mentioned, that those with PTSD have these deep traumatizing memories, and MDMA kind of makes everything euphoric. And so it enables the person to sort of confront these painful traumatic memories in a way that they're not typically able to, which may help them unravel them and kind of become more friendly with them, instead of it being an aversive thought where anytime it comes up, you shy away and you don't want to think about it. It can become something that you embrace, which can unravel some of this inner conflict. And so what it sounds like, what I'm interpreting is that MDMA assisted therapy for
OCD in outside of the context of PTSD, where it is driven by some other factor. Maybe it's some sort of genetic risk factor or something else. Something else entirely drives the OCD. MDMA may not be an appropriate intervention, but for comorbid OCD and PTSD, where OCD kind of is like a stalk branching off from the PTSD, where the root of the OCD is the PTSD, MDMA-assisted therapy may be able to kind of chop down that tree and therefore reduce the symptoms of OCD. Is that proper? Does that make sense?
It's actually the opposite, almost, but the opposite. No, it's okay. It's okay. And that's just because I'm sure I may have skipped over things that might be relevant, but effectively, so the OCD and PTSD, it's not like the root of the OCD is a PTSD. It's a separate condition, but it can be functionally dynamic with the PTSD to where like sometimes someone's obsessions are not just irrational things that, like, for example, what if my house burns down? It's like, what if this, for me, for example, what if I get cancer again? But it's not like I'm going to get cancer again, I'm afraid. It's what if I get cancer again, and doing compulsions to try to avoid that, versus the PTSD element of my cancer experience is like, I might get cancer again, I might die, this is debilitating, like it's different. And so that can look very similar and have similar themes, but they function differently in a person. And so in the context of just MDMA assisted therapy for OCD, that might work really well. That might be amazing, partially because the psychotherapy they receive is the evidence-based correct treatment for OCD, which is called exposure and response prevention therapy. It works completely different than PTSD treatments, even though exposure therapy, exposure and response prevention, they sound similar, but the clinicians is trained basically to have someone expose themselves to their obsession and then not do compulsions. It sounds very simple, but it's actually very, very difficult, and why there's such a high dropout rate, which maybe psychedelics might help with that. But in MDMA assisted therapy for OCD, that may or may not help someone. We don't know. Maybe the MDMA, I mean, there have been anecdotal like case reports of MDMA inducing OCD in people. So like that from a long time ago. So maybe it'll hurt, maybe it'll help. We don't know. But for MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD with comorbid OCD, it can very much be harmful to people because their OCD might be hurt, even though they might be seemingly improving in their PTSD. And that's a net negative. And so like my simple recommendations for moving forward was like, include OCD in the exclusionary criteria and test for OCD in the battery of tests that are required to be able to even get into the trial or treatment. And if all else fails, in the suite of, there's like 20 plus treatments that are like different modalities of treatment, like cognitive behavioral therapy, psychodynamic therapy, EMDR, somatic experiencing, tons of other things. Amidst all of that, also train someone in the one evidence-based treatment for OCD, ERP. And so if someone makes it in there and ends up doing compulsions and having OCD flares instead of PTSD, they could get the effective treatment in that scenario rather than being overshadowed.
Awesome. Well, thank you for clarifying that. And here we have a real life example of me asking a question and it being wrong. And I'm glad I asked, because I would have helped that misconception. So we're way over time, but I'm going to ask you one more question because I think it's a really good one. Please recommend resources, papers, books, courses, etc., for someone who knows very little about the use of psychedelics for mental health disorders.
Oh my gosh, where do I begin? This is a you and me question because you literally do this too. I would say to do the thing Ben said about PubMed, because there's different. Okay, well, I would actually go to clinicaltrials.gov and start with just looking at the different clinical trials for different psychedelics. And for that, maybe a list would be, you would Google a list of different classic psychedelics and hallucinogens and things that are kind of called psychedelics, but are not, like ketamine and kind of MDMA and stuff, and then look up different clinical trials and just see the methodologies and the different indications they're being looked at for, because there's so many. And the reason I say go to clinical trial is because they're updated all the time, and it's hard to find a comprehensive list of absolutely everything going on right now. But I would start by looking at those trials because it's really fascinating to see the effect sizes and how different it looks compared to traditional treatments that have, been explored for the last 40 years, like in terms of general pharmacological treatments. And then in terms of books, I mean, it depends on if you're looking at it from more of the clinical perspective / the more empirical perspective versus more looking at the use of psychedelics overall in our world and in indigenous cultures. Like there's many resources for that too. But I mean, I don't even know where to begin in terms of referring an actual book. Do you have any that come to mind?
I have one in my hand.
Oh, okay. There you go.
This is if you're looking for a really like high level and I mean high level by like you're really high over top, kind of flying by. How to Change Your Mind, Michael Pollan. This is like the book that sort of spawned this like psychedelic culture currently, at least like the modern. It seems like it was really impactful. And now there's a Netflix series if you also don't like to, or yeah, it's a Netflix series. There's 3 episodes, I think, which is really great. But it does genuinely. Michael Pollan is a great author. He's not a scientist, but he's a journalist and an author, and he does a really great job of summarizing everything again at a high level. The Netflix series is actually really interesting to watch, and like genuinely just makes for good TV. Also, I haven't read it, but a friend of mine, Julie Holland, has a book, Good Chemistry. I just want to make sure yeah, that's correct. So she's a psychiatrist and psychedelic researcher. So it's called Good Chemistry. I think I recommend it. I've met her and she is brilliant and really understands the stuff well and is a great communicator. So I'm assuming her book is fantastic. So I'd recommend both of those. Other than that, as far as courses, okay, and we just put Mind and Matter podcast with Nick Jackomis. I'm not sure.
Yeah, he hosts a podcast and has like basically all the PIs doing the research in the field, like Charles Nichols, David Nichols, Gould Dolan, just like anyone that comes to mind. And then I forgot the obvious answer, the Intercollegiate Psychedelics Network. We have seminars and journal clubs and all the things with all the people who are doing the research. We're about to have David Olson on, who just his lab released a paper that then had the awesome summary in terms of intracellular serotonergic action. So join IPN. It's free. It's awesome. Tons of content. And there's a wide variety of content too. We just had William Leonard Picard and Dr. Nishay Deveneaux give a book club. So there's amazing things there too.
Awesome. Well, and last thing, as far as courses, I'm not sure, maybe there's a chance that there's like some online courses. I think podcasts are a great sort of replacement for that. There's definitely lots of podcasts on psychedelics. And I also, although I would normally say to consult the peer-reviewed literature, it's just like currently an explosion of psychedelic research. So if you search psychedelics on PubMed, there's probably 1,000 new papers every month. So you could look for review papers, or you could go with some of these more kind of like higher level options that we're talking about here. But Robin Carhart Harris also has published a lot of the big clinical trials. Someone put it in the chat. Well, I don't want to take up any more of anyone's time. I'm sure those who are still here are enjoying the discussion. I appreciate you sticking around. Whoever's AI assistant that is note-taking, if they have like a summary, please send it to me. I would love to have that. That would be fantastic. But Uma, thank you so much again. It's been really fantastic to hear about your journey and to hear about your research, and it's really interesting. And I'll be very closely now monitoring the MDMA OCD relationship. But if anyone has questions, I think you put up your email in the beginning or at the end of your slides.
Yeah, you can find me anywhere at Uma R. Chatterjee. My email's hello@umarchatterjee.com. I'll just type it in the chat. My podcast is A Chat with Uma, where I talk a lot about everything. And yeah, I'd love to answer your questions, hear from you. Excited to keep in contact with everyone. And thank you so much, Ben, for having me and for all your questions and just being so kind in everything you do for the field. You're making such a difference. And this is a testament to that right there.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Uma. I feel the exact same way about you and the work you're doing. And all right, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day or night, depending on where you are.